The words still rang in her ears as if they had been carved into her very bones. "You don't belong at this table, Ruth." Her father hadn't shouted them. He hadn't needed to. His voice, cold and measured, cut deeper than any whip or lash. Ruth Maynard was just 12, her hands still calloused from long hours helping around the farm, her heart still desperate for one scrap of approval that never came. She had stood behind her father's chair, her plate trembling in her hands, waiting for him to nod. Instead, he pointed at the door, and when she hesitated, he slammed his fist against the wood of the table so hard that the lantern rattled. Her mother had looked away, her brothers had smirked, and Ruth had turned slowly, holding back the sob that wanted to tear free. She walked out of that house barefoot, no shawl, no supper, no home. The night was already closing in. Bitter wind swept down from the hills, cutting against her skin and turning every tear on her cheek to ice. She ran at first, not knowing where, just away. Away from the eyes that told her she was less than nothing. Away from the voices that mocked her for crying too much, talking too much, simply existing. She stumbled through brush and frozen soil until her legs gave out and she fell against a fence post. She pressed her face into her knees, her small body shaking as hunger twisted inside her. "Why was I even born if he can't love me?" she thought, her chest rising and falling in a rhythm of grief. Miles away, another soul sat at a table of his own. Samuel Cross had long ago stopped setting more than one plate, though he still owned them, stacked neat in a cupboard that hadn't been opened in years. He had lost his wife to fever, lost the child she carried with her, and with them he had lost every reason to keep a place waiting across the table. His days were work and silence, his nights no different. He would eat stew alone, clear the dish alone, and let the fire burn low while the shadows whispered their old reminders. He had once been a man who filled silence with laughter, who held children on his lap while telling them stories of trail rides and narrow escapes. Now he was the man who spoke to no one, who believed God had taken family from him forever. That night Samuel sat in his cabin on the edge of Pine Hollow, the sound of the storm growing restless outside. The fire cracked, sending sparks into the chimney, and he leaned back, his head heavy with thoughts. He had been dreaming again of what might have been tiny footsteps on the floorboards, a woman's hand brushing against his, a child's voice calling him father. He rubbed his eyes and pushed the thought away as he always did. Dreams like that hurt more than wounds that bled. But just as he lifted his cup to drink, he heard it. Faint, broken, yet unmistakable, a knock at his door. At first he thought it the wind, a branch dragged across the cabin wall. But then it came again, weak, desperate. Not the kind of knock a man gave, but the kind of knock one gave when strength was all but gone. Samuel rose slowly, his boots heavy against the wood. He pulled the latch, opened the door, and froze. There she was. A girl no more than 12, her hair tangled with twigs and snow, her cheeks red with cold, her eyes swollen from crying. She didn't try to speak at first. She only stared at him with a gaze so hollow and raw it stripped the words from his throat. Her small body shook as if the cold might shatter her bones at any second. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking, "just don't send me back." Samuel stood in silence, his hand gripping the doorframe. Something inside him, something buried so long he had forgotten it, twisted sharply. He looked past her, out into the storm, and knew there was no one else out there. No parent following, no brother waiting. She was alone. And so he stepped back. "Come inside," he said, his voice low but firm. The girl stumbled forward, nearly collapsing onto the floor. Samuel caught her arm, steadying her, and led her to the chair across from his. The chair that had sat empty for so many years. She clutched it like an anchor, her tiny hands pale and trembling before she finally sat down, eyes darting nervously toward him as if she still expected to be struck or dragged back outside. Samuel crouched to her level, his weathered face softened by something he hadn't felt in a long time. "What's your name, child?" Her lips trembled. "Ruth," she whispered. For a moment he didn't speak. He simply nodded, the firelight catching in his eyes as he reached for the kettle. He poured warm water into a cup, slid it across the table and said only, "You belong here tonight." The girl pressed the cup to her lips with both hands, trying to drink without spilling. And for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, the cabin held more than silence. It held possibility. But neither knew then that Ruth's father was not the kind of man to let defiance pass unpunished, nor that Samuel's act of kindness had just placed him at the center of a storm far greater than any that rattled the cabin walls. Ruth drank slowly, each sip sending warmth down into the hollow ache of her stomach, but her eyes never strayed far from the man across the table. Samuel sat with his back straight, his hands folded loosely in front of him, studying her with a patience that unnerved her. He wasn't her father, that much was clear. His gaze didn't carry that weight of disdain, nor that simmering expectation that she would fail no matter what she did. But Samuel's silence was heavy, not cruel, and Ruth wasn't sure if it meant he was deciding whether to let her stay or throw her back out into the night. She hunched her shoulders and gripped the cup tighter, her lips trembling against the rim. Samuel broke the silence at last, his voice rough, as though words had not passed his lips in a long while. "When's the last time you ate?" Ruth's brow furrowed. She tried to think back, but the days bled together in her mind, hunger dulling her memory. "Yesterday morning," she whispered, "crust of bread." Samuel rose without a word and moved to the cupboard. The hinges groaned as he opened it, revealing jars and sacks lined neatly, the kind of order only a man alone maintained. He retrieved a small loaf, hard on the outside but still good within, and placed it before her. "Eat slow," he said. "Your belly's empty enough it might turn on you." Ruth hesitated, her eyes darting up to his. He gave a small nod and she tore a piece off, chewing with a reverence that almost broke Samuel's heart. He'd seen hunger before. Men on long cattle drives, drifters who'd lost their way. But there was something different when it hollowed the eyes of a child. "You come far?" Samuel asked after a moment, his tone even. Ruth swallowed hard, wiping her mouth with the back of her sleeve. "Not so far," she admitted, "just away." Samuel didn't press. He could see the raw edge of her words, the way her chest tightened as if speaking any more might unravel her completely. He had lived long enough to know when silence was safer than questions. Still, he studied her carefully. Her dress was torn at the hem, her hair tangled, her hands reddened from the cold. But it was her eyes that told the story. They carried the kind of weariness he had only ever seen in grown folk who had buried too much. She wasn't just tired, she was used to being tired. Samuel leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking beneath his weight. He felt the pull of something deep within, a voice he hadn't heard in years. "She needs someone, Samuel, and maybe you do too." But another voice rose just as quick. "Don't be a fool. You open your door to a stranger, you invite her troubles too." He glanced toward the window, toward the storm that still hissed against the glass. There was more than snow waiting out there. There was a world that devoured the weak and punished those who tried to stand against it. Ruth broke the silence this time. Her small voice carried like a fragile thread. "He said, I don't belong." Samuel's head lifted. "Who did?" She lowered her gaze, her fingers tightening around the crust of bread. "My father." The words hung between them, heavier than any storm. Samuel felt something twist in his chest, an anger he didn't know he could still feel. Fathers were meant to shield, to guide, to love even when it hurt. To cast a child out was a betrayal that reached heaven itself. "Why?" Samuel asked, though his tone softened as if to lessen the blow of the question. Ruth's lip quivered. "Said I talk too much, said I ask too many questions, said I'm not like the others." Samuel's eyes narrowed. He had no children of his own, fate had stolen that from him, but he knew cruelty when he heard it. A man who measured his child's worth against silence and obedience was no man at all. "You belong," Samuel said, his voice low but steady. Ruth looked up sharply as if the words were too heavy to believe. "Don't matter what he said, don't matter if you're different, you belong somewhere, and for tonight that somewhere is here." Ruth swallowed hard. Tears glistened in her eyes, but she fought them back. She had learned not to cry in front of men, but something about Samuel's tone, the quiet conviction of it, cracked the wall she had built. She sniffled, wiped her nose with her sleeve, and whispered, "Thank you." Samuel gave a single nod, then rose to fetch another quilt from the chest by the hearth. He draped it gently around her shoulders, careful not to startle her, then added more wood to the fire. Sparks leapt, light warming the cabin as shadows retreated into corners. But even as the fire grew, so did the unease in Samuel's chest. He knew the land, knew the kind of men who ruled households with fists and fear. If Ruth's father discovered she had run here, if he even guessed, he might come. And men like that didn't come to talk. The thought gnawed at him long into the night. Ruth fell asleep curled in the chair, the quilt wrapped tight around her small frame, her head tilted against the wood as her breath came slow and steady. Samuel sat opposite her, the fire's glow painting lines across his weathered face. He thought of his wife, long buried, of the child he had never held. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to wonder if God had not taken family from him forever, but perhaps had given him another chance in a form he never expected. His eyes drifted to the girl's tiny hand clutched against the quilt, and he felt that chance deep in his bones. But Samuel also knew chances came with cost. And when the knock came again, not the frail knock of a desperate child, but the heavy fist of a man who believed the world was his to command, Samuel realized that cost had arrived sooner than he feared. The cabin shook with the force of it. "Ruth," a voice thundered, raw and furious, slicing through the night. "You in there? You think you can run from me?" Ruth jerked awake, her eyes wide, terror flooding her face. Samuel rose, his jaw tight, his hand brushing against the rifle propped by the hearth. His cabin had been silent for years, but tonight it would answer back. The pounding on the door rattled the hinges again, harder this time, followed by the scrape of boots against the porch. Ruth's breath came in sharp gasps as she clutched the quilt tighter around herself, shrinking down into the chair as if she could vanish into the wood. Her lips formed a whisper, but no sound escaped. Samuel saw the fear etched into her young face, the same kind of fear that lingered long after bruises faded. His hand tightened around the rifle stock, though he didn't yet raise it. The voice outside bellowed once more, fury dripping from every syllable. "Ruth, get out here right now, before I drag you by the hair myself." The words cut through the cabin walls, cruel enough to make Samuel's jaw clench so hard he felt his teeth grind. There was no mistaking the venom in the man's tone, no mistaking the claim of ownership he spat like she was cattle and not a child. Ruth whimpered and covered her ears, rocking slightly in the chair. Samuel took one slow step toward her, crouched down until his eyes met hers, and spoke in a low, steady voice that carried no doubt. "He won't touch you, not while you're under my roof." The girl looked at him, searching for a trace of hesitation, and when she found none, something loosened inside her. She nodded weakly, though her tears still brimmed. Samuel rose again and moved toward the door. He didn't throw it open immediately. He let the silence sit just long enough to remind the man outside that this was his home, not some barnyard where threats carried weight. Finally, Samuel slid the latch and opened the door. Cold air rushed in, biting at his skin, and there stood a man with rage in his eyes and whiskey on his breath. Broad-shouldered, red-faced, his coat hanging off him like it was more burden than garment. His fists were balled at his sides, his chest heaving with righteous fury. "You got something that belongs to me," the man growled, his eyes cutting past Samuel toward the fire where Ruth sat trembling. Samuel didn't move from the threshold, blocking the man's view as best he could. His voice came calm but carried an iron edge. "That child don't belong to a man who throws her out in the cold. You lost the right to call her yours the moment you barred her from your table." The man sneered, stepping forward, but Samuel planted his boots firm. "Careful," Samuel warned. "You're already standing closer than you ought to." For a tense moment, Neither man moved. The storm had quieted to a hiss, snow drifting softly from the eaves, but the air between them burned hotter than fire. The father's jaw worked as if chewing on words he couldn't swallow. His eyes darted to the rifle cradled casually in Samuel's grip, then back up to the rancher's steady stare. "You don't know what kind of trouble you're inviting, Cross," he spat finally, recognizing the man before him. "You think taking in strays will fill that empty house of yours. You'll regret it." Samuel's gaze didn't flinch. "I'll regret nothing. What I won't do is watch a child freeze because her father decided she weren't worth a seat. You best turn back, Maynard. Tonight you walk away, or you'll find out just how little patience I've got left." Maynard's eyes narrowed at the use of his name. The weight in Samuel's voice carried a warning too plain to ignore. For a second the man looked ready to lunge, to strike, to prove himself master over more than his own blood. But something in Samuel's stance, unshaken, resolute like stone carved from the very land, made him hesitate. He cursed under his breath, spat into the snow, and jabbed a finger toward the door. "This ain't finished," Maynard growled. "You can't keep what's mine. I'll be back, and next time I won't be knocking." Samuel closed the door slowly, deliberately, never breaking eye contact until the latch clicked. He listened as the man's boots crunched down the path, fading into the night, though the echo of his threat lingered heavier than the storm. Inside, Ruth had curled into herself on the chair, eyes wide, breath ragged. When Samuel turned back, she looked at him as though expecting him to turn on her next, to blame her for bringing danger to his door. Instead, he crossed the room, set the rifle back against the hearth, and crouched before her again. "You're safe," he said firmly. "He won't take you from here." But Ruth's voice cracked. "He always comes back, he don't stop." Samuel's face softened, though steel still underpinned his words. "Then I'll be here when he does, and I won't let him lay another hand on you." Ruth stared at him, tears slipping down her cheeks. She had heard promises before, empty ones, broken ones, but something in Samuel's tone carried weight, like the earth itself had spoken. For the first time, she let herself believe. The hours that followed stretched long. Samuel kept the fire fed, his ears tuned to every sound beyond the walls. Ruth dozed fitfully, waking at every gust of wind, her body wound tight with fear. Samuel didn't sleep at all. He sat near the hearth, his eyes on the flames, his thoughts turning to what Maynard's return would mean. He knew men like that, prideful, cruel, never satisfied until they'd proven their power. He would come again, and he would bring more than words next time. Morning broke pale and thin, sunlight fighting its way through heavy clouds. Ruth stirred, her face soft in the glow, and Samuel realized how fragile she looked, smaller even than her years suggested. He brewed coffee and heated what little porridge he had left, setting it before her without ceremony. She ate slow, her eyes still wary, as if expecting it to be snatched away. "You'll eat at this table as long as you're under my roof," Samuel told her. "Don't matter who says otherwise." The girl's lips trembled. She nodded quickly, clutching the spoon as though it were a lifeline. Samuel didn't push further. He had seen enough scars to know some wounds needed time to show themselves. But as the day wore on, he couldn't escape the weight pressing against his chest. Maynard's threat hung over the cabin like a storm cloud. Samuel worked outside, mending fences and chopping wood, his eyes always on the ridge. He knew trouble when it set its eyes on him, and trouble was marching his way. Ruth followed him into the yard after breakfast, her small figure bundled in the quilt. She trailed behind, silent at first, but finally asked, "Why'd you open the door?" Samuel paused mid-swing, the axe lodged in the block, and looked at her. "Because someone had to." She tilted her head, frowning. "But you don't even know me." Samuel pulled the axe free, set it aside, and crouched until his eyes met hers. "Sometimes it don't matter if you know a person. Sometimes you just see what they need and you do what's right." Ruth studied him for a long moment, as if measuring the truth of his words. Slowly, almost shyly, she asked, Can I help?" The question caught him off guard. He had expected fear, silence, maybe even defiance. But here was this child, cast aside by her own blood, asking to stand beside him. Samuel nodded once. "You can carry the kindling." She smiled faintly, small, fragile, but real. It was the first smile he'd seen from her. And in that smile, Samuel felt something shift inside him, something he thought long dead stirring awake. But the peace of that morning was short-lived. By midday, a trail of dust rose from the valley. Samuel saw it first, his heart sinking as he set down the axe. Riders, more than one. Their silhouettes grew clearer as they crested the ridge, 3 men, Maynard at the lead, and they weren't coming to talk. Samuel's hand went instinctively to the rifle leaning against the porch. Ruth followed his gaze, her breath catching as she saw her father astride a horse, his eyes burning with cruel triumph. She clutched Samuel's sleeve, her small voice breaking into a whisper. "He's back." Samuel placed a steady hand over hers, his jaw tightening as he watched the riders draw closer. "Then we'll be ready." The storm Ruth had feared all her life was no longer just at the door. It was thundering down the trail, and Samuel Cross knew the time for silence had ended. The sound of hooves drew nearer, each beat carrying with it the certainty of confrontation. Samuel stood firm on the porch, his eyes narrowing as Maynard and his 2 companions slowed their approach. Their horses snorted clouds of steam into the chilly morning air, the tack jingling as the men pulled to a halt just a few yards from the cabin. Maynard sat tall in his saddle, his expression twisted into a smug sneer, as if the land, the sky, and every soul beneath it belonged to him by birthright. The other 2, rougher men, likely hired hands, flanked him like wolves waiting for a signal. Ruth stood just inside the door, her small hands gripping the edge of the frame. Her face was pale, her body trembling, but her eyes never left her father. She recognized that look, the one that always came before shouting, before fists, before doors slammed in her face. Yet here in Samuel's doorway, something felt different. For the first time in her life, there was a wall between her and her father's wrath, and that wall was Samuel Cross. Maynard broke the silence first, his voice carrying across the yard with false civility that fooled no one. "Morning, Cross. Seems you've taken it upon yourself to harbor what don't belong to you." He jerked his chin toward the doorway where Ruth hovered. "That's mine." Samuel didn't flinch. He rested one hand against the porch railing, his rifle within easy reach, though he kept it pointed at the ground. His tone was calm, but it carried an undercurrent of warning. "She ain't yours, Maynard. Not in the way that counts. Blood don't mean a thing if a man treats his child worse than a stranger." One of the hired men chuckled darkly, but Maynard's sneer only deepened. "You don't know what you're meddling in, Cross. That girl needs a firm hand, and I'll not have some lonely fool filling her head with weakness." At the word weakness, Ruth flinched. She had heard it too many times, had it carved into her spirit like a brand. But Samuel's voice rose, steady and unshaken, cutting through the morning air. "You call kindness weakness. I call it the only strength worth having, and as long as she's under my roof, you won't raise a hand to her again." The tension hung thick, the kind that made horses shift uneasily and birds fall silent. Maynard's hand brushed against the butt of his pistol, his eyes flashing. "You think you can keep her from me? You think you can stand against me and walk away whole?" Samuel's gaze hardened. "I don't think, Maynard, I know." For a long, dangerous moment, the 2 men locked eyes. Then Maynard spat into the dirt and turned his horse slightly, gesturing for his men to follow. "This ain't finished," he said, his voice low and venomous. "You got yourself in the middle of something you'll regret. I'll come back when the law's on my side, and when I do, you'll wish you'd never opened that door." With that, he yanked the reins and wheeled his horse around. The 3 riders galloped off, their figures soon swallowed by the trees, but their threat lingered like a storm cloud refusing to break. Samuel exhaled slowly, the tension draining from his shoulders as he lowered his hand from the rifle. He turned back toward the cabin, where Ruth still stood frozen in the doorway. Her wide eyes searched his face, waiting for some sign of doubt, some flicker that he might send her away now that trouble had found them. Instead, Samuel stepped inside and closed the door gently behind him. "He won't scare me off," he said simply. "And he shouldn't scare you either. You're safe here, Ruth." The girl's lips quivered, and for a moment it seemed she might crumble under the weight of her fear. But then she whispered, so softly Samuel almost missed it, "He's never walked away before." Samuel crouched so that his eyes met hers, his voice carrying a quiet certainty that steadied even his own heart. "Then maybe it's time someone stood in his way." Ruth's eyes filled with tears, but this time they weren't just from fear. There was something else there, something new, hope. The day that followed was restless. Samuel worked outside, his ears always straining for the sound of hooves returning. Ruth shadowed him closely, carrying kindling and fetching tools, eager to prove herself useful. She didn't say much, but every now and then Samuel caught her watching him with a mixture of curiosity and disbelief, as though she couldn't quite grasp why he hadn't sent her back. As evening fell, Samuel lit the lamp and set 2 plates on the table. Ruth hesitated at the threshold, her small frame outlined in the glow of the fire. She looked at the chair across from him, then back at him, uncertain. "You belong at this table," Samuel said, gesturing firmly. "Sit." Ruth swallowed hard, her hands twisting in her lap, before she finally slid into the chair. The simple act of setting her plate down on the worn wood made her chest tighten with an emotion she didn't fully understand. It was as though something she had long been denied, something so basic she had almost stopped yearning for it, had suddenly been restored. They ate in silence at first, the only sound the crackle of the fire and the clink of utensils against the plates. But as Ruth grew braver, she glanced up and asked, "Why don't you have a family?" The question struck Samuel like a hammer blow, but he didn't let it show. He set down his fork, his gaze falling into the shadows that danced along the walls. "I did once," he said quietly. "Lost them. Fever took my wife, took the baby with her." His throat tightened, but he forced himself to meet Ruth's eyes. "After that, it was just me." Ruth's brow furrowed. "So you've been alone all this time?" Samuel nodded once, "Until last night." The girl blinked at him, her lips parting slightly. The words settled over her like a blanket, soft, unfamiliar, but warm. She looked down quickly, her cheeks flushing, but Samuel saw the way her shoulders straightened just a little, as if she carried herself with new weight. That night, as Ruth curled beneath the quilt by the hearth, Samuel sat awake in the chair, staring into the fire. He thought of Maynard's threat, of the law he claimed to wield, and he knew the man wasn't bluffing. Trouble was coming, not just in the form of fists but papers and judges, men who could twist justice to favor the cruel. Samuel had never cared much for courts, but now the fight would not just be against Maynard. It would be against a world ready to cast Ruth aside because her father said she didn't belong. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. Samuel rose and checked the door, his hand brushing against the rifle once more. His home had been silent for years, a place of solitude and sorrow. But now it had become something else entirely, a refuge, a line drawn in the dirt, a place where belonging was not granted by blood but by choice. And he was ready to defend it. The morning broke clear and sharp, the sun spilling over the ridge in pale gold light that set the frost shimmering like shards of glass. Samuel was already awake, boots crunching across the frozen yard as he split wood in clean, rhythmic strokes. Each swing of the axe was steady, controlled, but his mind was anything but. Maynard's words still echoed in his head, "This ain't finished." Samuel knew they weren't idle threats. A man like Maynard would sooner choke on his own pride than let a child slip from his grasp, and pride was a poison that turned men into something worse than beasts. Inside, Ruth stirred from her place near the hearth. She blinked in the morning light, her face soft with sleep, until memory rushed back in like a flood. She sat upright quickly, eyes darting to the door as if expecting her father to burst through at any moment. When she saw only Samuel's silhouette through the frosted window, Her shoulders eased slightly. She gathered the quilt around her and padded softly toward the table where the plates from last night still sat, neatly stacked. She touched the wood of the chair across from Samuel's, her small fingers tracing the grooves worn deep by years of use. It was a chair that had been empty, untouched, until she arrived. Samuel returned with a bundle of wood under his arm, his breath steaming in the chill. He set it down by the hearth and gave Ruth a nod. "Morning," he said simply. "Morning," she whispered, her voice still carrying the tremor of caution. He poured water from the kettle into 2 cups, pushing one toward her. "Drink, warm you up." Ruth obeyed, her hands trembling slightly as she lifted the cup. They sat in quiet for a while, the kind of silence that wasn't heavy but careful, like the first steps on a frozen pond. Finally, Ruth asked, "Do you think he'll come back today?" Samuel didn't answer immediately. He sipped his own cup, his eyes fixed on the fire. At last he said, "If he's the man I reckon he is, then yes, sooner or later." Ruth's face fell, her lips pressing into a thin line. She lowered her gaze, staring into the cup as though it might offer answers. Samuel watched her for a moment, then set his cup down with deliberate calm. "But if he comes, he won't find you alone this time. That's the difference." Her eyes lifted to his, searching, measuring, and for a fleeting second Samuel saw something shift. Not full trust yet, not after years of cruelty, but the beginning of it, fragile and trembling like a flame caught against the wind. After breakfast, Samuel set to his chores. He showed Ruth how to scatter feed for the hens, how to carry water without spilling half of it on her boots. She followed close, eager but unsure, her small frame bundled in an old coat of Samuel's that dwarfed her. He didn't laugh at the sight. He only cinched it tighter around her shoulders and told her it would keep out the cold. By midday, her cheeks were flushed from the work, her eyes brighter than he had seen yet. But peace was never meant to last. It began with dust on the horizon, faint but undeniable. Samuel saw it first while mending the fence, the line of disturbance against the pale sky. He set his hammer down, his jaw tightening. Ruth followed his gaze and froze. "Is it him?" she whispered. Samuel squinted, the silhouettes of riders sharpening as they drew closer. "Aye," he said quietly, "and he ain't alone." Fear flooded Ruth's face, but Samuel placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "Inside," he said firmly. "Stay low, keep by the hearth. No matter what you hear, you don't open that door." She nodded, though her lip trembled. She hurried back to the cabin, clutching the quilt like armor, and Samuel watched until the door closed behind her. Then he turned back to the ridge, his expression hardening into something unyielding. This time Maynard brought 5 men with him, all mounted, their faces shadowed beneath wide brims. They rode with the kind of swagger that came from too much whiskey and too little conscience. Maynard led them, his coat flapping behind him, his sneer wider than before. "Cross," he shouted as they reined in near the cabin. "I told you this wasn't finished." Samuel stood by the fence, his rifle resting casually against his shoulder, his stance calm but immovable. "And I told you she don't belong to you." One of the riders laughed, a cruel bark. "Ain't your place to decide that, old man." Samuel's gaze flicked over them, steady as stone. "Maybe not, but it's my land. And on my land no child will be turned out or beaten down. You want to test that, you best be ready for what follows." Maynard's sneer faltered just slightly, but pride stiffened his spine. He swung off his horse, boots hitting the ground hard. "You think you can defy me? The law's on my side. She's mine by blood and by right." Samuel took one slow step forward, his voice like gravel. "The law may be blind, but God sees, and he don't favor men who cast away their own flesh." The words struck deeper than any bullet. Maynard's face twisted, his pride stung, but he covered it with a snarl. He gestured sharply to his men. "Take her back. Tear that door down if you have to." The riders hesitated, their eyes flicking from Maynard's fury to Samuel's unflinching stance. The rifle in his hand wasn't pointed yet, but the weight of his conviction was heavier than lead. They shifted uneasily in their saddles, sensing the kind of man who wouldn't miss if forced to fire. Samuel's voice rang out, steady and cold. "Any man who crosses that threshold will not walk back out." The silence that followed was suffocating. Even the horses pawed nervously at the earth. The hired men glanced at each other, none eager to be the first to test Samuel's word. Maynard's chest heaved, his pride battling against the truth in the air. He stepped closer, his face inches from Samuel's. "You think this ends here? You're a fool. I'll bring the sheriff. I'll bring papers. You can't win against the law." Samuel didn't blink. "Maybe not, but I can win today, and today's enough." The two men stared at each other, the world holding its breath. Finally, Maynard spat at Samuel's boots, fury radiating off him in waves. He turned sharply, mounting his horse with a jerk. "You'll regret this, Cross, mark my words." He wheeled his horse around, his men following reluctantly, and the thunder of hooves faded once more into the trees. Samuel exhaled, lowering the rifle slowly. His hand trembled faintly, not from fear, but from the weight of what had nearly been. He turned back to the cabin, where Ruth's pale face peered through the window, her eyes wide with terror and awe. He stepped inside, setting the rifle gently against the hearth. Ruth ran to him, her words tumbling out in a rush. I thought he'd take me. I thought you'd." Samuel knelt, placing both hands firmly on her shoulders. His voice was steady, every syllable carved with conviction. "I told you, he won't touch you here, not while I draw breath." The girl's tears spilled freely now, but this time they weren't just from fear. They were from the shock of being defended, of someone standing where no one had before. She buried her face against his chest, and Samuel wrapped his arms around her with a tenderness he hadn't known he still carried. But even as he held her, his mind churned. Maynard would come again, not with fists or hired hands, but with the law twisted in his favor. Samuel had faced storms, droughts, and wolves, but this would be different. This would be a war not just for Ruth's safety, but for her very right to belong. And Samuel Cross was ready to fight it, no matter the cost. The night that followed carried a different kind of stillness, one not born of peace but of waiting. Samuel sat at the table long after Ruth had fallen asleep by the hearth, her small body curled beneath the quilt like a fledgling tucked against the storm. He ran his calloused fingers along the rim of his cup, staring into the embers as they glowed and dimmed. His cabin, once filled only with silence and memories, now breathed with the fragile rhythm of another life. And with it came a burden he had not carried in years, responsibility for someone else's tomorrow. He rose quietly, not to disturb Ruth, and stepped outside. The moon hung low, veiled in thin clouds, painting the snow-draped ground in silver. Samuel's breath curled into the cold air as he scanned the tree line. No movement, no sound but the groan of the wind through the pines. Yet he knew Maynard well enough to understand that threats were promises with teeth. If not tonight, then soon, the man would return with something stronger than bluster, papers, men with badges, a law twisted to his liking. Samuel had seen it before. Children beaten down by fathers who knew how to charm judges, women trapped by men who wore respectability like a mask. The world beyond his cabin wasn't just cruel, it was cunning. Inside, Ruth stirred and whimpered in her sleep. Samuel returned, kneeling beside her. Her small face was pinched tight, as though even in dreams she could not escape the echo of her father's voice. Samuel brushed a hand gently over her hair, a gesture so simple it startled him. He had not touched another's head with tenderness since the day he laid his wife in the ground. Something inside him ached, not just from sorrow but from the flicker of something he had thought forever lost. Hope. The next morning dawned brittle and bright. Samuel stoked the fire and set a pan of cornmeal to cook while Ruth rubbed the sleep from her eyes. She sat at the table without needing to be told, and Samuel slid a plate in front of her. It was nothing more than porridge, thin and plain, but the way Ruth's eyes lit made Samuel feel as though he had set down a feast. She ate carefully, savoring every bite, pausing between spoonfuls as though afraid the food might vanish if she didn't stretch it out. After breakfast, Samuel set to chores, Ruth following him into the yard. He showed her how to split kindling, how to hold the axe with both hands steady, though he didn't let her swing yet. She watched intently, her eyes wide, as though each act of work was a lesson in more than wood and fire. When he paused to catch his breath, she asked shyly, "Was I really allowed to sit at the table, or was that just because he was gone?" Samuel looked at her, and in her question he heard years of dismissal, years of being made to feel unworthy. He set the axe down and crouched until he met her eyes. "Ruth, listen to me. That table ain't mine alone anymore. It's yours too. When you sit there, you sit as someone who belongs." Her eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. Instead, she nodded, pressing her lips together as though storing his words inside her chest where no one could take them away. But the fragile peace of that morning cracked by midday. A rider came down the trail, not Maynard this time, but the sheriff, his badge glinting against his coat. His expression was grave, his posture heavy with reluctance. Samuel spotted him before Ruth did, his stomach tightening as he set aside the kindling. He stepped forward, meeting the man at the edge of the yard. "Morning, Cross," the sheriff said, his voice carrying the weight of weariness. "Got a situation on my hands." "I reckon you do," Samuel replied evenly, his eyes narrowing. The sheriff shifted in his saddle, looking past Samuel toward the cabin. "Her pa came into town last night. Made his case loud enough for half the saloon to hear. Says you're harboring his daughter against his will. By law, she's his blood, and that gives him claim." Ruth had stepped outside quietly, drawn by the sound of voices. She froze when she saw the sheriff, her small hands clutching at Samuel's coat. Her eyes brimmed with fear, her breath catching in her throat. Samuel placed a steady hand on her shoulder, anchoring her. "You and I both know what kind of man Maynard is," Samuel said to the sheriff. "Blood don't give a man the right to starve his child or throw her out into the cold." The sheriff sighed, his eyes dropping to the reins in his hands. "You're not wrong, but you know the law don't see it that way. Unless I got proof of neglect, I'm bound to return her." Ruth's grip tightened on Samuel's coat. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking, "don't let him take me." The sheriff's jaw tightened. He looked away as though her plea had cut deeper than he could admit. Samuel squared his shoulders, his voice carrying iron. "If you take her back, it won't just be her you answer to. It'll be me. And I won't stand down." The two men stared at each other, years of respect between them weighed against the burden of duty. Finally, the sheriff exhaled. "I'll give you time, Cross, a day, maybe two, but Maynard won't quit and he'll bring papers when he returns. If you mean to keep her, you'd best be ready for a fight bigger than this valley." With that, the sheriff turned his horse and rode back down the trail, leaving behind the kind of silence that pressed like a stone against the chest. Ruth buried her face against Samuel's side, her small frame trembling. "He's going to take me," she sobbed. "I'll never belong anywhere." Samuel knelt, pulling her close until her tears dampened his coat. His voice, low and steady, cut through her panic. "You belong here, and if it takes every breath in my body, I'll see to it that no man, no paper, no law tears you from this place." The girl clung to him, her sobs shaking her small frame. Samuel held her, his own chest tight with a vow he knew would cost him dearly. He had lived years alone, untouched by the world's battles, but God had set this child on his doorstep, and he would not abandon her to cruelty. That night, as Ruth finally slept in the safety of his bed while he took the chair, Samuel sat awake staring at the shadows dancing on the wall. He thought of Maynard's fury, of the sheriff's warning, of the law that would soon come knocking with papers in hand. And for the first time in years, Samuel prayed aloud. Not for himself, not for peace, but for the strength to fight for the child who had been told she didn't belong. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew one truth as sure as the fire that burned in his hearth: Ruth belonged here, and he would face down heaven and hell to prove it. The dawn was not kind. It rose gray and heavy, with low clouds dragging across the ridge like a warning. Samuel had been awake long before the light came, his boots planted by the door, his rifle resting across his knees. The cabin was quiet save for Ruth's breathing, steady but shallow as she slept in the bed he had given up for her. Each rise and fall of her chest was a reminder of what he was fighting for, and each groan of the timbers as the wind pressed against them reminded him of the storm brewing far greater than weather. When Ruth stirred, she rubbed her eyes and looked for him first, as though checking that he hadn't vanished in the night like so many promises before. When her gaze found him, she sat up, hair tangled, cheeks pale, but her lips pressed into a line of determination. "Is today the day he comes?" she asked softly. Samuel studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Aye, if not him, then men with papers in their hands. Either way, today's the day." Her hands tightened around the quilt. Fear flickered in her eyes, but so did something else, resolve. Samuel felt his chest tighten at the sight of it. Children shouldn't have to wear such expressions. They shouldn't have to brace for battle just to claim a seat at a table. But this world rarely gave what was fair. It gave what men were willing to stand and take. He rose, set the rifle against the wall, and crouched in front of her. "Listen to me, Ruth. No matter what's said, no matter what threats they bring, you remember one thing. You belong here. They can shout, they can wave papers, but it won't change the truth. You belong." Her lips trembled and she nodded, gripping the quilt tighter. "I'll remember." The hours that followed dragged slow, each minute stretching taut. Samuel worked outside, stacking wood, tightening the fence rails, anything to keep his hands busy while his ears strained for the sound of hooves. Ruth shadowed him, carrying small pieces of wood, sweeping the porch, doing anything to keep from sinking into dread. They spoke little, but their silence was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the silence of allies bracing for the same storm. It came by midday. The dust cloud on the ridge, the glint of sunlight on metal. Samuel saw them first, and his stomach hardened. Not just Maynard this time, but two riders beside him, and behind them a wagon. As they drew closer, Samuel's jaw tightened. On the wagon's bench sat a man with a hat too fine for this valley, his coat clean, his expression colder than stone. The law had come. Ruth froze when she saw them, her face draining of color. She clutched Samuel's sleeve, whispering, "It's him," and he brought the law. Samuel placed a steady hand over hers. "Let them come," he said, his voice low, steady as a mountain. "We'll meet them head on." The riders pulled up at the yard. Maynard dismounted first, his smirk wide, triumphant. "Cross," he said, spreading his arms as though greeting an old friend. "Told you I'd be back, and here I am. Brought the lawman with me. This here's Judge Pritchard, and he's got papers sayin' the girl belongs with me." The man on the wagon bench stepped down, brushing dust from his coat. He unfolded a sheaf of papers from his satchel, his voice flat and clipped. "By the authority vested in me, custody of the child Ruth Maynard remains with her father, Thomas Maynard. Harboring her against his will constitute unlawful interference." Ruth shrank behind Samuel, her fingers twisting in his coat. Her father's eyes glittered with cruel satisfaction. "Hear that, girl? Even the law says you belong to me. Now get over here." Samuel stepped forward, planting himself squarely between Ruth and the men. His voice rang with quiet power. "The law may have its papers, but I've got eyes. I see a man who cast his daughter into the cold, who denied her food and warmth. That ain't fatherhood. That's cruelty. And no paper written by man can make cruelty into truth." Judge Pritchard's gaze was icy. "Be that as it may, Mr. Cross, my word is binding. If you obstruct, you'll face consequences." Samuel's hand tightened at his side. His voice lowered, but the steel in it did not waver. "I've faced consequences my whole life. Loss, loneliness, silence. But I'll face every last one again before I hand her back to a man who'd sooner see her starve." The men shifted uneasily. Even the judge faltered for a moment beneath Samuel's stare. Maynard, however, stepped closer, his hand outstretched. "Ruth, Come now, don't make this harder." The girl shook her head violently, tears streaking down her cheeks. "I don't want to go, please." Her father's voice snapped like a whip. "You don't have a say." Samuel's chest heaved, his eyes burning with a fire he had thought long extinguished. He placed his arm firmly around Ruth's shoulders, drawing her against him. His next words came like a vow carved into stone. "She has a say. She says no, and that's the only answer that matters." The yard fell silent. The judge cleared his throat, clearly unprepared for such defiance. Maynard's face twisted with rage. "You'll regret this, Cross. I'll see you fine, jailed, ruined." Samuel didn't flinch. "Then ruin me, but she stays." The standoff stretched taut like a rope pulled to breaking. Then, unexpectedly, the sheriff appeared at the edge of the trail. He had come quietly, riding alone, but his presence landed like a thunderclap. He dismounted slowly, his eyes sweeping from Maynard to Samuel to Ruth. "Judge," he said, his tone even, "before you make any ruling, maybe you ought to hear something." The judge frowned. "Sheriff, the law is clear." "Clear, maybe," the sheriff interrupted, "but so's the truth. I've been in this valley long enough to know Maynard here, and I know his girl too. I've seen her run half-starved through town. I've heard the neighbors whisper when he shuts her out. So if you're asking me to enforce a piece of paper that puts her back in his hands, I won't do it." Maynard spun, his face purple with fury. "You can't defy me, Sheriff. You're sworn." "I'm sworn to uphold the law," the sheriff said, his hand resting casually on his belt. "But I answer to something higher too, and I won't put a child back in the grip of a man who treats her worse than a stray dog." The judge faltered, papers fluttering in his hands. His authority wavered against the weight of the sheriff's words, the truth too stark to deny. Samuel stood tall, his arms still firm around Ruth, his eyes locked on Maynard. "This ends today," Samuel said, his voice ringing. "She belongs here, with food, with warmth, with someone who sees her worth. You can bring law, you can bring men, but you can't change that truth." Ruth clung to him, her tears wetting his coat, but her sobs carried something new now, something fierce, something alive. They carried belief. For the first time in her life, someone had stood before the world and declared she belonged. Maynard's fury broke into a snarl, his fists trembling at his sides. But even he knew when a crowd had turned, when his power was slipping. He spat into the dirt, mounted his horse with a jerk, and snapped at his men to follow. The judge, rattled and uncertain, tucked his papers back into his satchel and climbed into the wagon. Together they rode off, their figures swallowed by the trees, their threats trailing like smoke. The yard fell silent once more, the only sound Ruth's trembling breath against Samuel's chest. He bent low, his voice rough but steady. "It's over, Ruth. He won't take you again." Her arms tightened around him, her small voice muffled but fierce. "I belong here." Samuel closed his eyes, the weight of her words pressing against every scar he carried. He held her tighter, his chest aching with something too vast to name. Family. Not by blood, but by choice, by love, by the kind of belonging no law could write away. Yet even as relief settled over them, Samuel knew the battle was not entirely won. Papers and threats might return. But now, standing in the yard with Ruth in his arms and the sheriff at his side, Samuel also knew this. They would not face it alone. The sheriff lingered after the riders disappeared, his hat pulled low as though the weight of what had just transpired pressed heavier than his badge could bear. He leaned against the fence post, his eyes scanning the cabin, the yard, the small figure still clinging to Samuel's coat. When at last he spoke, his voice was quiet, almost regretful. "You've stirred a hornet's nest, Cross. Maynard won't forget this slight, not as long as he draws breath. He'll try again, maybe with more men, maybe with a court that listens to the silver he lines their pockets with. You sure you're ready for that fight?" Samuel didn't look at him. He lowered his gaze instead to Ruth, her small hands gripping him as though letting go meant falling into a pit she might never climb out of. His arm tightened around her shoulders, and when he finally answered, His voice was steady as the ground beneath their boots. "I've been ready since the moment she knocked on my door." The sheriff's eyes softened. He tipped his hat and turned to his horse. "Then I'll do what I can to keep this valley safe for her. But remember, Cross, sometimes law bends, sometimes it breaks. Make sure your spirit doesn't do the same." With that, he mounted and rode off down the trail, leaving behind a silence that was thick but no longer suffocating. Samuel stood in the yard a long while, the rifle still leaning against the porch, Ruth still pressed against his side. The world felt like it had shifted, like something fragile had been broken but something stronger had taken its place. He guided Ruth back inside, closing the door softly behind them. The fire had burned low, and he knelt to feed it more wood, sparks leaping into the chimney like stars caught in a draft. Ruth watched him, her eyes red from tears but brighter somehow steadier. When he settled back into the chair, she spoke, her voice small but clear. "He won't come back tonight, will he?" Samuel shook his head. "Not tonight." "Then," Ruth hesitated, biting her lip before continuing, "then can I sit at the table again?" Samuel's chest tightened. He rose, pulled out the chair across from his own, and gestured. "That seat's yours, Ruth. It always will be." She slid into it carefully, her small hands smoothing the quilt around her lap. For a moment she simply sat there, silent, letting the weight of belonging sink into her bones. Then, with a tentative smile, she said, "Feels different here, like I matter." Samuel's throat constricted. He swallowed hard and managed a nod. "You do matter. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." That night, supper was nothing more than stew stretched thin, but it might as well have been a banquet. They ate facing one another, the firelight flickering across their faces, the silence between them no longer hollow but full of something both of them had been starved of for too long. Later, after Ruth had curled into bed, Samuel sat at the table alone, staring at the empty plate she had used. He thought of all the nights he had eaten alone, the chair across from him a reminder of what he had lost. Tonight it was different. Tonight the chair had been filled, and the cabin had felt alive. His eyes lifted to the rafters, and his voice, rough from disuse, whispered into the stillness, "Thank you." The days that followed brought no sign of Maynard, though the threat lingered like a storm beyond the horizon. Samuel and Ruth settled into a rhythm. He taught her how to gather eggs without cracking them, how to carry water without spilling, how to stack wood neatly. She followed him with eager steps, soaking up every bit of knowledge, her laughter breaking free more often, her eyes no longer darting at every sound. One evening, as the sun bled crimson over the ridge, Ruth sat on the porch beside Samuel, her legs dangling over the edge. She was quiet for a long time before she finally asked, "Why'd you do it? Why'd you keep me when you knew he'd come for me?" Samuel looked out at the horizon, the weight of years heavy in his gaze. "Because once long ago I prayed for a family. I lost the one I was given. But then you came, knockin' on my door, askin' without askin'. And I reckon God was answering that prayer in a way I didn't expect." Ruth's lips parted, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She leaned against his arm, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then I reckon he answered mine too." The words pierced Samuel deeper than any bullet ever could. He wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close, and together they watched the last light fade from the valley. Weeks later, when neighbors began whispering about Maynard leaving the territory, about debts finally catching up to him, Samuel listened but didn't gloat. He only tightened his arm around Ruth whenever she glanced at him, reassurance flowing in the steady beat of his silence. The fight wasn't about winning against a man like Maynard. It was about showing a child that she was worth fighting for. And in the end, that truth was louder than any threat, stronger than any law, unshakable as the mountains themselves. One evening, long after the danger had passed, Ruth set the table herself, 2 plates, 2 cups, a small loaf between them. Samuel came in from the yard, sweat and dust on his brow, and stopped short when he saw her waiting, the firelight glowing against her face. Thought maybe tonight we could both sit, she said, her smile tentative but steady. Samuel swallowed hard and nodded, his voice thick. Aye, tonight and every night after. They ate together, not just survivors bound by circumstance, but something far greater. Not just protector and child, but family, chosen, unshaken, and forever bound by the moment she knocked on his door and he chose to open it. And in that cabin at the edge of Pine Hollow, a girl once told she didn't belong at the table found her place at last. Spring came slow, but it came. Snow melted into rushing streams, the ground thawed, and with it Ruth's spirit bloomed. She no longer asked if she belonged. She simply lived it. Each evening, 2 plates sat at the table without question. 2 voices filled the silence with talk of small things that meant everything. Samuel still worked hard, still bore the weight of years behind him, but now his days ended not in silence, but in laughter and prayer whispered with Ruth's small hand folded in his. The world beyond the cabin might still have its storms, but inside those walls a truth stood unshaken. The lonely rancher was lonely no more, and the girl who once wept at being denied a place had found not just a chair, but a home, a family, and a father who chose her.